The Union Pacific Big Boy was called Indestructible, a 604,000-pound titan built to conquer mountains and outlast any rival. But on a cold April night in Wyoming, a single mistake sent Big Boy number 4005 and its 62-car train off the rails, ending lives and shattering an industry legend. How could America's mightiest locomotive be brought down so swiftly? To understand the fatal flaw, we have to start at the very beginning. In the late 1930s, Union Pacific faced a challenge that demanded a new kind of machine. Freight traffic over Wyoming's Sherman Hill was booming, but the steep grades and long trains pushed existing locomotives to their limits. The solution came from the minds of Union Pacific's mechanical team and the engineers at the American Locomotive Company, better known as ALCO. Their goal was simple in concept, but daunting in scale: to build a locomotive strong enough to haul 3,600 tons of freight over mountain passes without the need for double-heading or helper engines. Wartime urgency shaped every decision. Steel was scarce, and the demands of moving troops and supplies across the West meant reliability could not be sacrificed for raw power alone. The result was the Big Boy, a 132 feet long, 604,000 pounds behemoth with a wheel arrangement described as 4884, capable of producing over 6,000 horsepower. Only 25 would ever be built between 1941 and 1944, each emerging from ALCO's Schenectady plant as a testament to American engineering ambition. Every detail, from the massive boiler to the articulated frame, was designed with Sherman Hill in mind. These locomotives were not just bigger, they were built to conquer the harshest terrain, day after day, under the relentless pressure of wartime schedules. For Union Pacific, the stakes went beyond pride. The success of the Big Boy would determine whether one railroad could move the nation's freight faster, farther, and more reliably than any rival. At their debut, no one imagined the limits of these giants would ever be tested. Big Boy's arrival on the rails was more than an engineering milestone. It was the birth of a legend. Railroad magazines, newspapers, and company brochures all played their part, painting these locomotives as unstoppable forces. To the public, the Big Boy was a steel colossus, stretching 132 feet 9 inches from coupler to coupler and weighing in at over 604,000 pounds. Its sheer size dwarfed anything else on the tracks. School children memorized its stats, and engineers spoke of it with a mix of pride and awe. The articulated frame, with its 2 sets of 8 driving wheels, allowed the Big Boy to snake around mountain curves that would defeat lesser machines. But this articulation, while ingenious, introduced stresses that no one could truly measure until years of hard use had passed. Each trip over Sherman Hill sent shockwaves through the locomotive's joints and bearings, testing the limits of steel and human craftsmanship. Outwardly, these giants appeared unbreakable, an icon of American power and progress. Yet beneath the myth, every mile added invisible strains, and every thunderous run hinted at vulnerabilities no one wanted to see. The legend of invincibility grew with every successful haul, but the seeds of uncertainty were already sown, waiting for the day when the myth would face its ultimate test. April 27, 1953. The Union Pacific Big Boy, number 4005, thundered west through the barren expanse of Wyoming's Red Desert, its headlight carving a path across the windswept prairie. 62 freight cars stretched behind the locomotive, loaded with livestock and goods bound for distant markets. Up front in the cab, engineer Leo Murray kept a steady hand on the throttle. Fireman Lawrence Ed Endress tended the firebox, feeding the hungry boiler. Brakeman James R. Anderton watched the rails ahead, alert to any sign of trouble. In the caboose at the rear, conductor James Walker and brakeman Ivan Shurigar rode out the night, keeping watch over the rolling train. The Big Boy's boiler roared with power, its massive pistons driving two sets of 8 wheels each. The train moved at 50 miles per hour, routine for a locomotive of this scale, but still a formidable speed on these remote tracks. The cold night air pressed against the cab windows, carrying the scent of sagebrush and livestock. Inside, the crew worked in practiced silence, each man trusting the others and the machine beneath them. These were experienced railroaders, men who had spent years on the line. Assignments to the big boy were reserved for those with skill and steady nerves. Every trip demanded precision, especially on a route known for sudden changes and hidden dangers. The red desert lay quiet except for the distant thunder of steel on steel. Track maintenance crews had been working near a siding, their lanterns bobbing in the darkness as they finished up for the night. A switch at the siding had been operated earlier by the section crew, routine work, but always a point of caution for passing trains. The crew in the cab had no reason to expect anything out of the ordinary. The signals ahead showed clear. The rails glinted in the moonlight. The locomotive's momentum seemed unstoppable. As the train approached the siding, every element was in motion. The relentless drive of the wheels, the hiss of steam, the faint jostle of cars behind. The men in the cab relied on routine and years of experience, but the night offered no warning. The open prairie gave way to the low shapes of maintenance sheds and section houses, barely visible in the darkness. The big boy's whistle cut through the night, a signal to anyone nearby, a declaration of presence on the lonely line. In the next instant, everything would change. The locomotive, the crew, and the myth of invincibility all hurtled toward a fate no one could see coming. The routine of 1,000 nights on the rails was about to be shattered in a single, irreversible moment. The moment Big Boy number 4005's wheels hit the open switch, the world narrowed to chaos. 62 cars of freight, livestock, and steel momentum surged into disaster. The locomotive, nearly 600 tons in motion, lurched sideways, its left side grinding against the earth. The tender, loaded with thousands of gallons of water and fuel, jackknifed forward, crushing the cab beneath its weight. Inside, engineer Leo Murray and fireman Ed Endress stood no chance. The force of the tender's impact obliterated the cab, ending their lives instantly. Brakeman James Anderton, pinned in the twisted wreckage, was left exposed to live steam hissing from ruptured pipes. Scalding vapor filled the air, creating a deadly barrier that kept rescuers at bay. For nearly 25 minutes, the wreck site was a scene of confusion and horror. Steam vented in great clouds, obscuring the locomotive and making any approach impossible. The sound was deafening, a constant roar punctuated by the cries of livestock and the distant shouts of would-be rescuers. Freight cars lay scattered along the right-of-way, some flipped completely over, others reduced to splintered heaps. Pigs, shaken loose from their shattered pens, ran wild through the debris. Highway patrolmen and railroad workers, unable to control the chaos, were forced to shoot some of the animals for safety. The rear crew, stunned but physically unharmed, scrambled from the caboose and made their way up the torn track bed. Conductor James Walker found the dispatcher's phone and reported the crash, his voice unsteady as he described the devastation. Local residents and highway patrol arrived quickly, but none could reach the front of the train while live steam poured from the broken boiler. The prairie night, moments before so ordinary, was now lit by the glow of burning debris and the shifting shadows of men and animals moving through the wreckage. When the steam finally subsided enough for rescuers to approach, the full cost became clear. Murray and Endress were gone, their bodies trapped beneath the collapsed cab. Anderton, still alive but suffering from severe burns and trauma, was pulled from the wreckage and rushed to the hospital in Rawlins. Despite every effort, he died 2 days later. The accident left 3 families grieving and a railroad community in shock. The scale of the destruction paralyzed rail traffic for hours. A temporary bypass had to be built before trains could move again. For Red Desert's scattered residents, the sight of overturned cars, loose livestock, and the shattered remains of a machine once thought invincible would linger for years. No one at the scene could yet answer how such a catastrophe had happened. But the need for answers would soon draw investigators from across the railroad world to the windswept wreckage in Wyoming. Railroad investigators arrived at Red Desert before dawn, boots crunching over frost and cinders as they traced the torn rails and scattered debris. The switch at the siding drew their attention immediately. Its lever stood in the open position. It was still locked for a diverging route, an unmistakable sign that the main line had not been restored after track work. For a locomotive as massive as Big Boy 4005, an open switch at speed was a death sentence. Section Foreman Kenneth Mayfield and his crew had been working at the siding earlier that night. Among them was Ralph Vicente, a recent hire from Puerto Rico, who had been on the job for just 80 minutes. According to company records and later testimony, Vicente spoke little English. Communication with the rest of the gang relied on gestures and hurried translation. When investigators asked him to explain the sequence of events, Vicente answered through an interpreter, his voice uncertain. He insisted the foreman had shown him how to operate the switch, but said he had been told to leave it as it was. Mayfield, in turn, told the inquiry he had instructed Vicente to line the switch back to the main, as required by safety rules. Each man's account contradicted the other, and neither could offer proof. Witnesses from the section gang described a rushed job. The crew had been gathering ties for track repairs, working by lantern light. Mayfield, under pressure to finish before the next freight run, assigned Vicente to handle the switch. The language barrier left procedures unclear. No one double-checked the switch position before leaving the siding. In the confusion, the most basic safeguard, restoring the mainline route, was missed. The Interstate Commerce Commission's field team pieced together the timeline from interviews and physical evidence. The switch had been left open for at least an hour before the accident. Signal indications for an open switch would have been visible to the oncoming train, but not soon enough for a heavy freight at 50 miles per hour to stop safely. The engineer's emergency brake application left deep scars in the ballast, but the laws of physics offered no mercy. Responsibility, the commission concluded, rested on both men. Mayfield was faulted for assigning an inexperienced, non-English-speaking worker to a critical safety task without proper supervision. Vicente, despite his inexperience, was held accountable for failing to restore the switch. The coroner's jury echoed these findings, ruling that Mayfield's decision amounted to criminal negligence and that Vicente's actions directly triggered the disaster. The record of the investigation, preserved in terse official language, left little doubt. A single lapse, magnified by haste and miscommunication, had erased the lives of 3 railroaders and toppled a legend of American engineering. The consequences of that night rippled outward, sparking debate over hiring practices, training, and the silent risks of language barriers on the rails. For the families of the crew and the wider railroad community, the question of blame offered little comfort. The facts, laid bare on the windswept prairie, told their own story. A chain of human errors that proved even the mightiest machine could be undone by a moment's oversight. In the weeks after the Red Desert wreck, the shockwaves spread through every level of Union Pacific. Headlines questioned how a single open switch could destroy the pride of the fleet and take 3 experienced railroaders in an instant. Inside company offices, the mood hardened. Memos from Omaha to the Cheyenne Division called for a review of every operating rule, every crew assignment, every procedure that had been taken for granted. The accident report, heavy with technical detail and personal tragedy, landed on the desks of railroad executives and federal regulators alike. The language was blunt, a failure of oversight, a breakdown in communication, and a fatal gap in training had cost lives and crippled $1 million locomotive. Union Pacific's response was swift and, for many, overdue. Foremen were ordered to document every assignment of new hires, especially those with limited English. Training bulletins were rewritten to emphasize switch safety, and supervisors faced new penalties for lapses in oversight. Section crews, once left to learn by example, now faced mandatory drills and written tests. The company's internal newsletter, usually reserved for retirements and promotions, published a somber summary of the accident and the new rules that would follow. For the first time, railroad leadership acknowledged that language barriers and rushed training were matters of life and death. Beyond the immediate changes, the accident forced a reckoning with the future of steam itself. Repairing Big Boy number 4005 took months in the Cheyenne shops. The locomotive's frame, battered but intact, was rebuilt, and a new cab was fabricated to replace the one destroyed in the wreck. Big Boy number 4005 returned to service, but the scars, both mechanical and symbolic, were impossible to ignore. Maintenance costs soared, and every run reminded crews of how close the line between routine and disaster had become. Company minutes from late 1953 reveal a growing impatience among top brass. The old arguments in favor of steam, raw power, and tradition, and the pride of running the biggest engines in the world, were losing ground to the cold math of efficiency and safety. Diesel locomotives, already making inroads across the system, now looked not just modern but essential. They required less maintenance, fewer crew members, and offered a margin of safety that steam could no longer match. Engineers who once saw themselves as masters of fire and steel now watched as their engines were reassigned, stored, or dismantled. By 1959, every Big Boy had been retired from mainline freight. The 4005, despite its return to duty, was pulled from service for the last time in 1962. Unlike most of its siblings, which were scrapped or left to rust, the 4005 was spared the torch. Instead, it was donated to the Forney Museum of Transportation in Denver, where it stands today, a silent witness to both the triumph and the limits of American steam. For Union Pacific, the accident at Red Desert was more than a tragedy. It was the point at which the old ways could no longer be defended, and the future, faster and safer and powered by diesel, became impossible to resist. The legend of invincibility was gone, replaced by a new era shaped by hard lessons and the memory of a night when everything went wrong. Today, the Big Boy stands silent in a museum, a monument to ambition and vulnerability. As railroads still move billions of tons across fragile infrastructure, the lesson endures. No engineering marvel is immune to human error or overlooked flaws. Every advance in technology carries risk, and safety always demands vigilance. Some legends survive, but only because we remember why they nearly didn't. Share your thoughts below.